Wolf Grigorievich Messing was born into a poor Jewish family in a small Polish town that was part of the Russian Empire in 1799. He was a person who created himself, became world famous, and lived 75 incredible years. Some believe that his activities were just myths, and many of his predictions and life events were fabricated. Others, however, based on personal memories or stories from relatives, admire his extraordinary abilities. He was able to predict the day of his death and warned his loved ones to avoid contact with the world of the dead, as he believed it was dangerous. He claimed that if a person crossed this boundary, they would disappear from the world of the living because a return would be impossible. This was not about death, but rather about the fact that the person would be forever forced to communicate with the afterlife, unable to lead a normal human life. Perhaps he himself knew how hard it was to hear voices and carry all this information inside. Being a seer among the blind is unbearable. Contact with the world of the dead is always associated with the risk of losing one's health, and sometimes even the lives of loved ones. Often, this burden falls on several generations of a family, with the most valuable thing a person has being lost. This also applies to sick children. The firstborn can be saved with the help of a sacrifice to cleanse the family karma, but that is another topic, which I will discuss later. Wolf began showing his incredible abilities as early as his childhood. Once he was able to walk, his father often noticed how his son would wander around the house at night with his eyes closed. In his sleep, he could not control himself, but he could see and predict events. At the age of 6, he dreamed that his beloved cow would die, which he told his parents, and this event indeed happened the next day. When he moved to Berlin and started working as a messenger, his heart began to beat faster, and his blood circulated slower. But soon, he lost consciousness. He was found lying on the street, taken to the hospital, and then to the morgue, as he showed no signs of life. He lay in the morgue for 2 days before regaining consciousness, just before the autopsy was supposed to begin. It is said that during these 2 days, he made a pact with higher powers, who would thereafter give him guidance on what would happen next. Later, Messing began to show incredible hypnotic and telepathic abilities. For example, he promised an unknown seller at the market that his neighbor would pay back the debts. It turned out that the neighbor was indeed thinking about it. He used hypnosis by showing the conductor a white piece of paper and looking him firmly in the eyes. Some consider this to be an invention, but any fortune teller on the street can do something like that. Already as a teenager, Messing began performing in the circus and actively using his abilities, finding hidden objects, making people give their jewelry to their neighbors. He entered university and earned a degree in psychology, but there he experienced an unpleasant incident due to a false accusation. He was sent to prison, and they tried to force a confession out of him, but Messing remained calm, hypnotized the guards, and made them start a fight. Later, with the permission of the state control, he held solo performances and used his abilities for the benefit of society. During the war, he built 2 fighter planes at his own expense. He gifted the first Yak SE to Lieutenant Colonel Konstantin Kowaljow after learning that he had been awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The inscription on the plane's fuselage read, "A gift from a Soviet Patriot VGN, the Soviet Council, the Baltic Fleet, KF, Koval," and Messing became friends and often visited each other after the war. He met his future wife, Ida Mikajlona Rappaport, in 1944 at a club in Novosibirsk after a performance. Ida suggested becoming his assistant, and he immediately agreed. He was 45, she was 20, and they began working together. Ida Mikajlona managed all of her husband's affairs, made tour schedules, and helped him on stage. 15 years later, Ida fell seriously ill. She was diagnosed with cancer, but she continued touring with her husband. "I will hold on, but just not for myself," she said. Messing knew exactly that Ida would die on the 2nd of August, 1960, at 7 in the evening. She passed away on the predicted day and at the exact predicted time. After her death, he could not return to the stage until a year later. In 1971, he was awarded the title of Honored Artist of the RSFSR. He also knew the date of his own death. He died on the 8th of November, 1974, from a long-standing leg injury he had sustained while fleeing from Gist in Poland. As for his attitude towards reincarnation, he considered it a rare phenomenon. He did not deny it, but unfortunately, he did not write anything about it. In 1961, a popular magazine published an article about Messing, in which he answered the question about the nature of his psychological experiments. He said, "My experiments have nothing to do with supernatural phenomena. Many of them can be explained from the perspective of modern science. I myself am an atheist to the core and do not believe in supernatural forces." Those who love the mysterious might have benefited from attending my performance at the Pachager Monastery, a large religious center, in June 1960. After demonstrating my experiments, many clergymen began to doubt the existence of God. As an atheist, he was naturally not familiar with the important dogmas, but let's be honest, hearing about reincarnation from an atheist, let alone communication with the other world, is something unusual. One day, in 1944, after one of his performances organized at a club in Novosibirsk, a woman knocked on Messing's dressing room. Exhausted from the hypnosis sessions, he broke his own rules and opened the door. His hand seemed to reach for the door on its own. In front of him stood an unknown woman who confidently explained that his assistant was not suitable, but she, Ida Rappaport, possessed all the necessary qualities and would fulfill the tasks much better. Messing immediately understood that it was fate and invited her to be his assistant for the next performance. They were both no longer young. He was 45 and she was somewhat younger. He felt that with this woman, they formed a unit, two halves complementing each other. Thus, she entered the life of the fortune teller, love, wife, assistant, nanny, and mother, without whom he soon could not imagine his life. Ida and Wolf hardly ever parted. Ida Michelona took care not only of the household, but also of all her husband's affairs. She organized meetings, made tour schedules, negotiated, and decided what they should refrain from. She not only performed on stage with him, but also practically led the concerts by passing notes from the audience and sometimes removing spectators who tried to insult Messing. After their wedding, the Messing family lived in a Moscow hotel for several years before, by Stalin's order, they were provided with their own apartment. Household matters were entirely taken over by Ida, who lovingly cared for him. Sometimes this took absurd forms. Wolf Grigorievich refused to call a taxi or stir sugar in a cup, but would watch with emotion as Ida immediately grabbed the telephone receiver, spoon, or knife to cut his meat on the plate. Wolf Messing adored his wife, who became the family he had lost in his childhood. After Aida's death, there was no serious woman in Wolf's life anymore. He no longer allowed women to come near him, and they, in turn, were afraid to approach such an intense person. In his presence, most people felt uncomfortable due to the tension and the awareness that the fortune teller could read their thoughts. Ida, however, was completely different. She acted naturally, radiating such warmth that he, exhausted from constant travel and performances, felt emotionally warmed in her presence. He tenderly called her and asked, "Where is my magic wand?" And she, placing her hand on her chest, answered, "Here." Ida Michelona was often asked, "How can you live with him? He knows everything you think, doesn't he?" And she, laughing, replied that she never had bad thoughts and was not afraid of him. Specialists who studied the Messing phenomenon claimed that Ida was a medium, a communicator between the clairvoyant and the people in the audience. Very often, during performances, she mentally relayed the requests and orders that people in the audience had written on notes. Messing carried them out flawlessly, and there was never an instance where he misunderstood his wife's thoughts. However, their brief happiness, which lasted 15 years, was abruptly interrupted by Aida's sudden illness. The doctors gave their verdict, cancer. She did not agree to an operation, and by that time, the period for effective treatment had passed. Radiation and chemotherapy brought little result. But Ida herself, despite the incurable disease, did not collapse. She persistently continued touring with her husband, assisting him at every performance. But the illness took its toll, and over time she became weaker, barely able to stand after a 2-hour performance, without showing it to the audience. And when the curtain fell, he carried her himself to the dressing room. Soon after, Ida Michelona was bedridden. Wolf, utterly devastated by grief, spent days by his sick wife's side. What was he thinking then? Did he regret not having children with Ida? Or did he, on the contrary, feel relieved that he had no descendants to pass on his terrible gift? It was probably truly frightening to know everything in advance, to foresee the death of a loved one, someone he loved more than anything else in the world. The doctors tried to cheer Messing up by telling him that even with such serious illnesses, sometimes improvements or even full recoveries were possible. But who, if not Messing, knew that it was a pure lie? He faintly heard their consolation, and one day he could not take it anymore and said, "You can talk to anyone, just not to me. I know exactly that Ida will die on the 2nd of August, 1960, at 7 in the evening." Of course, no one wished the unfortunate woman death, but everyone was driven by curiosity. Would the great fortune teller's prophecy come true? And she died exactly on the day and at the hour her husband had predicted. The day before, Ida Michaelona had asked him to fulfill her last wish. "Don't write the date of my birth on my gravestone. I don't like it when people walk around the cemetery and calculate how old someone lived, cut off from the outside world." He sat motionlessly day after day, staring aimlessly at one point. It was terrifying to look at him. The emotional pain burned him from the inside. During this difficult time, his late wife's sister, Ureta, was with him, taking care of the house and her son-in-law. Together, they drove daily to the Vostriakovsky cemetery to Aida's grave. After half a year, Ureta could no longer bear it. "Wolf, this can't go on. You must pull yourself together. You must work," she said. To which he replied, "I can't work. I feel nothing. Without her, I am empty." It wasn't until a year later that Messing could once again perform on stage in front of an audience. His assistant for a long time was Valentina Ivanovskaya, but other than their shared work, there was nothing connecting her to Messing. After his performances, he would bid her a cold farewell and drive somewhere, but never home, where everything reminded him of his wife. The authorities repeatedly sent Wolf to the cemetery, but his feet would not take him there. He knew that Aida's soul was not there. Who, if not he, who saw and knew everything? Wolf Messing also knew the day of his own death. When he mentioned this, some believed him, others did not. But everything happened exactly as he had predicted. When he went to the hospital for an operation, he bid everyone farewell, knowing that he would not return from there. And no matter how much the doctors reassured him that everything would be fine, he was not afraid. What had a man who had outlived his love by 14 years to fear? It is hard to say how much clairvoyance brought Messing satisfaction and how much it caused him suffering, because to live and not only know the day and hour of one's own death, but also the moment of parting from the most beloved person, that is quite difficult, not just psychologically. Interestingly, after the great fortune teller's death, scientists took his brain during the autopsy to study the Messing phenomenon. To their surprise, they found no abnormalities. It looked like the brain of an average person and nothing more. It was only to be concluded that Wolf Messing took the secret of his extraordinary gift to the grave.